In Chapter 15, we will be discussing the life and the works of Beethoven. Ludwig van Beethoven's contributions to music were pretty pivotal in the end of the classical era going into the Romantic period. And we will be looking at his contribution from the late 1700s to the early 1800s. This is a bit of Beethoven's biography, Beethoven's life, and you will be reading more about that in your books. One key part about Beethoven is that his musical contribution, though it was um, very influential in the world of music, he did not write very many compositions, especially compared to some of his um, peers, such as Mozart and Haydn. And this is the overview of Beethoven's compositions, which, if you remember some of the other composers that we have studied in this course, is much less than other composers, especially Mozart. Beethoven's musical or compositional life can be broken down into three different sections. The first section was basically where he composed more in the classical style, as he was used to, the style that was established very well by Mozart. And there were many factors in Beethoven's life that influenced him to write in that particular style. And then his style started to develop in the second section of his compositional life, 1803 to 1814, where he wrote most of his symphonies as well as piano sonatas. Then, towards the end of his life, Beethoven's composition started to get a little bit more troubled as his life started to deteriorate, especially as he began to develop deafness. So we hear a much different musical style in the third era. Some major notes in Beethoven's contributions include a slight change to sonata form, where his development sections became longer. He also had longer developments in codas as well. And one of Beethoven's biggest contributions is the change in the orchestra, as he added more instruments to the orchestra of the time, which moved things towards the full orchestra that we are used to today. Here is a comparison of what the orchestra looked like in Mozart's composition as opposed to Beethoven's. The biggest contribution being that he added more brass and percussion to his works. In this chapter, in this section of the course, we'll be focusing mostly on Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, which is probably the most recognizable of his pieces. And as you listen to this work, you will hear a clear example of what is called cyclic form, which is a style of music where a musical motif or motive is used often and throughout the entire piece of music. This particular form, this particular process will be used and adopted later by Romantic composers. When you listen to the first movement of Symphony Number 5, you will hear the motive that we were talking about in the previous slide. This is repeated often throughout the entire first theme. The second movement is in the form of theme and variations, which we have discussed in other chapters. Beethoven's third movement is in scherzo and trio form, which is very similar to minuet and trio form. However, it is a bit faster. And when you listen to the fourth movement, you will hear another sonata form movement. Also in this chapter, we will be discussing the classical piano, the instrument that was used in Mozart's time and started to um, become more popular as the harpsichord was less popular. On this slide, we discuss some of the similarities and differences between the two instruments. One of Beethoven's most famous piano sonatas is the Moonlight Sonata, which when you listen to it, you may recognize that piece as well. To close this chapter, we'll be discussing the characteristics of classical music. For example, the homophonic texture, the major and minor tonality, which is the system that most music uses today, a variety of rhythmic patterns within a classical music work. Melodies were often composed of short, balanced phrases, and the characteristic of classical music is to express a variety of moods within the work. Definitely um, a characteristic that we see in Beethoven's works. Dynamics did not have very sudden changes, but rather gradual changes throughout a work. The pieces were very long. You will notice that your listening examples include symphonies of many movements that are from 9 to 12, 13 minutes long. Musical instruments such as the piano and the violin were favored for solo works, and the orchestra became standard in that period of time. Sonata form was very popular, as well as other forms such as the rondo, minuet and trio, and theme and variations. And the four movement symphony plan was the most popular of this period of time. That concludes chapter 15.